welcome to What's Possible, Conversations with World-Class Coaches. Today, I have a special friend on, and the person who I've invited is somebody I met in a training. And you know those people who you meet and you just energetically feel like this is someone I want to be friends with and take this out of the training? Leah is that person. And so it actually was fun. She sent me a note, I think even a chat saying, we need to connect outside of this. And it's been just an absolute privilege and honor to grow our friendship. And I have such admiration for Leah Smart, who is joining us today. So a little bit about Leah. She is somebody who really lives what she's supposed to be doing, lives who she's supposed to be being. She doesn't just talk about it. She's an executive coach with Silicon Valley Change, and she also is full-time employed over at LinkedIn. Her LinkedIn career started it started years ago, but for the most recent 3 years in learning and development. And then she, and we'll learn more about that, had this moment of, I'm supposed to be doing something different. And so Leah is now full-time podcast host over at LinkedIn, and it's called In the Arena with Leah. If you do not already follow her, you will want to right now. Her podcast is phenomenal. She interviews world-class authors, best-selling authors, gets to talk to them about their book. Her questions are powerful. So definitely don't delay and start following Leah right away. So without any more introduction, because I want more time to chat with you, Leah, welcome to What's Possible.
Oh, thanks for having me. And thanks for that intro. And, right back at you. As soon as I saw you in our training, I was like, I want to be friends with that person. And so here we are almost 2 years later, which is crazy.
I love it. And it's so funny because you talk about getting to know people in person, and then COVID forced us to get to know people through Zoom. You still can feel energy over the Zoom. And so we were meant to be. So I am thrilled to have you talk about something that I have seen in you. And that's why I really wanted us to dial in to this topic. And so it's what's possible when you have a culture of self-discovery and reinvention. And I've seen you do that at LinkedIn, and it's impressive, but more than impressive, I've gotten to see how you get to live joy every day at work. And I think more people are looking for that. So can you, before we get deep into this, can you describe and really give us a definition, a working definition on what is a culture of self-discovery and reinvention?
Yeah, so I think there are, I'd zoom out by saying in certain conversations I've had, people are trying to figure out how to operationalize something like this or what structures you have to put in place. I certainly think there are tons of different structures you can put in place. But I think at its core, it's a belief and understanding that we're constantly growing as human beings. And that if that's the case, then we all need space to be able to understand what it is we want, where we're going, and how we want to contribute. And so, I was someone, absolutely, and we'll talk about this more, who, I say I fell into my first 5 jobs at LinkedIn. I've been at LinkedIn now for 11 years total. And it wasn't until I understood what I wanted, but more importantly, how I wanted to contribute, that I was able to move in my own direction. And even though there weren't structures in place for me to do this, there was a mindset and a belief, and there has been, I think in tech, there is one, that innovation is always necessary and it's welcomed. So I would say, it's the underlying belief that just as anything in the world that exists, we're all changing, growing, and transforming. I hope we are, right? If we're the same people we were 5 years ago, we might want to ask a question. So if that's the case, why would we want to be doing the same work every single year from the time we go into the job market into up until when we leave, whenever that is?
Yeah, absolutely. You're so right. We think, okay, if you want to have a long time play at a company, you're going to be in this group. And maybe even, I think it's hard to take the blinders off. Sometimes you'll think, okay, I'm just going to grow within a group. But to really take the blinders off and think, to the topic of our webinar, what's possible? What's possible here in terms of growth, even outside my little world? And I've seen you do that. Can you walk us through what you did. I keep saying I've seen you do that. So talk a little bit about your own journey, because I think in that people will really start to understand that self-discovery and the link to reinvention.
Sure. Yeah. So I graduated, and like a lot of people, I graduated out of business. My family has been in technology. I assumed I'd end up in technology or somewhere in one of those kind of worlds, tangentially consulting, something like that. I had no idea what that really meant. And I said it earlier, but I fell into my first 5 jobs. I've always been someone who's a high performer. I love work. I was not good at school. I am great at work. And so I loved work. I wanted to do well. I was high performing. And that meant that there were a lot of people who, as they saw me perform, wanted me in their worlds, right? So just like you said, you can be inside of a kind of an organization or an org within your company where you work your way up. And that's what I was doing. And I had a moment, I had moved into a role that I sort of took because I needed to change, but not because I really wanted it. So I was already a little bit dissatisfied. And there's that like equation for change where your dissatisfaction, I think dissatisfaction times vision times first step or something like that. So anyway, I was dissatisfied. And it just having to, I would say just starting with the admittance that I was dissatisfied was a lot. And I noticed that with a lot of people I work with, when I'm coaching or when I speak to people on the show, it can be really hard to envision what life is going to be like if it changes. And so it's often easier to just stay exactly where you are, even if you're not happy, even if it's not serving you, which you and I both know as coaches and as people who get coached, like we all do this. So I admitted to myself that I wasn't happy, and something in my gut was like, this isn't the right movie for me to be in. I don't know what my movie is, but this is the wrong film. And so I kind of had my little existential moment, didn't know what I was going to do, but knew I probably should leave LinkedIn. So I ended up leaving LinkedIn and doing something not purposeful work that I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I meant to do. But it was almost like, you have to get a little unstuck to start a new direction. And so it was like, LinkedIn is an amazing company and I love it. And it had been fantastic. My close friends worked at, everything was just perfectly bubbled. It felt like, and so I had to get a little unstuck was really what happened. I left for a year and a half. I went to another company. I had no intention of coming back to LinkedIn, but in that year and a half, I hired a coach. I'd never had a life coach before. And so I hired a coach that I literally found on Google. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm hiring someone to help me. And she helped me think about what I wanted. And at the time, what was clear was I really didn't know. I just knew a lot of the scripts that I felt had been written out and that I could, a lot of the other movies I could go into, if we're staying with that metaphor, I could hop in there easily, but it wasn't quite right. So like for a bit, I was like, I'm going to go get my MBA. And I looked at the top programs, like, great. But I knew deep down, I looked at those classes, I looked at, I thought about moving to these places and I was like, I don't really want that. And I still held on to it for a little longer because I was like, I don't know my movie. I don't get it, but I could follow all these things and be easier. And I think that happens a lot. So my path was not linear. I ended up, after hiring this coach, spending some time just deciding that I wanted to try something new, as far as just building skill sets. I had been only in sales historically. And so I did end up back at LinkedIn, mostly because I realized that in order to get the experience I wanted with people that I trusted and wanted to work with, who trusted me enough to take me out of my prior roles and put me into this reinvented role, my best bet was to go back to LinkedIn. So I, fortunately was able to do so, went through an interview process and came back to the company. It wasn't until that point or up until that point, I felt like I was doing all the right things. I was getting this new skill set in the role that I was in. I was back at LinkedIn. I didn't like my work though, if I'm being honest. And I was like, oh God, or is this happening again? Am I just the person who's perpetually dissatisfied? And I think all of us, yes and no, like, yes. And that part of life is to be dissatisfied and to want to create something else. That's what desire is all about. And it's amazing having that gap between where you are and where you want to go. So I then kind of had the oh crap moment of, I was doing well in a role that I didn't love. I could keep climbing the ladder or I could just totally jump off and see where I landed. And so that took me took me down a path of deciding that I wanted to become a coach, that I wanted to spend more time getting to know myself, that I wanted to ask myself really hard questions, that I was willing to go deep into a lot of my own personal development work and trusting that something would come out of it. And that's kind of how I landed here.
Yeah. Wow. I love what you said about just taking that one step, even if it's not the right step. I think we get so focused on it needs to be the right thing, but just taking a step to unstick you. One step can unstick you so that your brain can start to open up to what else and what's possible. And what I also heard a lot in your story, and tell me if this resonates with you, is a lot of shoulds that you were putting on yourself. I should do this, or I should just stay, or I should do business. And what I love is I could feel a conversation happening in your brain, or perhaps you and your coach of, but what do you want? You should do this. And is that the path you want to stay on for the rest of your life? Or do you really want to explore what makes your heart sing and what you're meant to be doing here, and really take the time to figure that out versus going the path of, I'll call it at least resistance, even though I think it ultimately feels like a path of major resistance when you're on the wrong path.
Oh, yeah. I feel like you and I are both, and I think our general society is very intellectually driven. So we use logic, we use our heads. That's what I've done most of my life. And yet what I discovered the last 4 years is every time I use my gut and every time I use my heart, the things happen that are supposed to happen. And it's not that it's always easy or perfect, but I go, oh yeah, this is it. And so I hadn't, until I became a coach, because, when you're becoming a coach, you're just getting coached basically for a year as you coach other people. It's like, gosh, I thought I was going to be helping people and I'm the one that needed the help. But, I realized like, wow, I'm not in touch with my body. I'm not as in touch with like what makes me come alive, with my energy, and with like that feeling of, the same feeling that we both had where we were like, we have to know each other, or the same feeling I've had multiple times with different things that have led me to where I am now, is like getting really in touch with this and to what electrifies you versus just the logic.
Yeah. I actually just saw somebody's post actually on LinkedIn that was really similar to what you're talking about. She did a year in review. As she's starting the new year, she looked at her past year and she said she was very surprised because the things that brought joy and success were not on her plan at all. And the stuff that she planned for, that she set the goals for, that wasn't what really bubbled up to the top as top memories or things that really drove her. It was those times during the year that she didn't plan for, but she trusted her gut. She listened to her intuition. And that's where her success and her joy came from. And it makes me think a lot of what you just were saying.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. There's so much. I am such a like planner. I love having like, okay, so I'll do this and I'll do this and I'll do this. And I remember one time I said something to my brother about my plans when I was in my 20s of like, I'll get married this time. I'll do this work. I'll do that. He's like, how did you plan that? Like, you don't get to plan all of this. And I was like, what do you mean? And so, it's the learning that like uncertainty is one of the only constants we have.
100%. And for the people who are listening, one clarification. As I said, Leah is an SVC coach, and Leah also works at LinkedIn. And that brings me back to what I really appreciate about LinkedIn. And I know there's some other organizations that are similar this way. You're able to have a side hustle. And I love that. I feel like it so embraces this idea of self-discovery. And you can't really call it necessarily reinvention, but it's allowing people to fulfill all different aspects of themselves by saying, okay, you're an employee at LinkedIn and you're thriving there, and you can also pursue this thing on the side. And by having both of those, I think they feed each other and they allow you to feel content and inspired in both arenas.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the beauty of working in tech and at a younger, youngish tech company, is that, when I started at LinkedIn, and somehow we've kept a lot of this in our culture, but when I started at LinkedIn, if you had an idea, it's like, great, when are you going to start doing it? Like nobody, you share it with the group, and that you better decide and discern how you want to share ideas with the group, because it will be your project to take on and run with. It's different because it's larger now, but it's not lost that essence in my experience in the areas that I've worked in. And I also am very drawn to that. I love ideas. I love building. I love creating. But something that we talk about at LinkedIn, and that I think, no company is perfect at this, but I do think as individuals, if you can create this for yourself, there is a lot of opportunity to be had, which is the 80-20 rule. So when you think about job crafting, it's like 80% of your time is spent doing what's on your job description, right? And we all know we probably do a lot that's not on our job description if we're working full time. That's just the way it is. But then the other 20% is like, what are you curious about? What are you excited about? What lights you up? Even if it has absolutely nothing to do with what you're doing the other 80% of the time. And I do try to really share that with people, that like, don't use your logic. Like there were so many things I was really curious about. And I was like, but how will that tie back into this and that? And the truth was, I couldn't see it in the beginning, right? Like I can see it now. I can connect all the dots. Like one of the examples I use is I've studied Kabbalah for a few years. And I'm not currently studying it today because I'm sort of on to the what's next. I'm very curious about different spiritual paths and religions and ways in which we connect to meaning and purpose in life, however we all do that. When I started, was like, I'm putting so much time and energy into this. How is it ever going to have anything to do with what I do every day? And at the time I was not in L&D, so it didn't make sense. But I ended up using a lot of the principles, like the basic consciousness principles I learned in Kabbalah with leaders when I was doing coaching or when I was, running a workshop. A lot of my ideas were coming from things that I understood that could be applied to anybody, doesn't matter your religion or whatever, that made sense to people. So that for me was like an example of just follow the curiosity and worry about how it's all going to connect later. It may never, but it also may be sort of the first step you take to unstick yourself. So there could be many other things down the line after.
Yeah. Follow the curiosity. It's so true. And just trust that the puzzle will come together. I do love that. And I think that everything we do and all the people we meet along those paths, they all end up being part of, going back to your use of movie for a metaphor, it's all part of your movie. They're different characters, they're different scenes, they're different scenarios, and it's all part of this movie that is not fully written because we're still here breathing. We're still here alive. So trusting that it'll weave in. And it also, I think, just makes you more interesting too, when you think about all the different studies. Leah is one of the most well-read people I have ever come across. You're hard-pressed to find a book that Leah has not read. So you are one of the most curious people. And I think it is what's allowed you to continue to grow leaps and bounds. Mm-hmm. I would love you to go a little bit further into your path, because I do think it's so important around following your gut and trusting your gut. And that's how you got into the podcasting. So you're in L&D, you're there for about 3 years, and then something turned. And so I'd love you to take it from there.
Yeah. So I started, like you talked about, the side hustle. We started this side hustle with myself and a co-host of the podcast as we were both becoming coaches. So this was prior to even being in L&D. We started this show and we kind of like squeezed in under the radar. There weren't really rules or even an understanding yet of exactly what was going to happen with podcasting. This is 2018. And so, it's still early days, but it was even earlier days in the podcast world. Myself and my co-host spent a couple of years recording together. It was just the two of us. I think and actually I think it's important to talk about how, like, when things get tough, because there's a lot of rhetoric right now about manifesting and creating what you want, and like living your dream life and your vision and all this stuff. And sometimes we forget to talk about the fact that, like, it can be really hard getting there.
Thank you for saying that. Yes.
Like, it's not all sunshine and roses. My 2021, which was the year that I did make this transition into the role I'm in today at the end of the year, was one of the hardest years I've ever had in my life. I experienced so much grief. And in part was in relation to the podcast. So I had a co-host, and after a few years, I recognized that we weren't growing in the same direction or at the same rate. And we hadn't, it's kind of like when you get married, like, most people don't talk about what happens when things go south, when everything's going north, right? So and like, we all want to live in like the dream world of like, oh, it's always going to be great. And it's like, well, it's probably not. There's going to be difficulties, but how we handle it is really important. We hadn't done that. And I think I learned in a big way how important it is to have conversations like that when you're working with someone. But it became apparent to me that we weren't moving in the same direction. And again, like, in my gut, I was like, I have to do this work. And this other person is not as, it's just not their path. They're not as passionate about it. And they had shared that before. And I kind of hadn't listened. It's like being in a relationship. Like, you see the signs, but you ignore them, kind of thing. Right. And so I had to make, it was agonizing, a really difficult decision to make the suggestion that we stop recording the show together, and that my co-host changed from a full-time co-host to someone who joined the show as like a guest host, and that I run the show. That was the hardest thing I have ever done. I cried for weeks. Like, that was when I met you. I think I was devastated. Yeah. And yet nothing changed about knowing so deep inside that it was the right choice. So once I shared this with my co-host, she was obviously not happy. And we had an interview coming up with the CEO of LinkedIn. And so she was planning to potentially leave LinkedIn. And, I said to her, you could still do this interview, like, this isn't like you being kicked out or whatever. It's just, let's figure it out, but, join. She chose not to. And what happened was, this was my first interview I had ever done with somebody one-to-one, was with our CEO.
CEO. Yeah.
I was like, this is a good practice. So I end up doing this interview. It was May. The interview itself wouldn't come out till September. Over the summer, I went into a hole and I rebuilt the entire show as a standalone, me doing it by myself. No clue what was going to happen. Still a side gig. In September, my CEO, the episode was live. I shared it with my CEO before it went live and his team, saying, hey, if you have notes, let us know. And he called me 5 minutes after he heard. Like, I literally sent it, and 5 minutes after, I get a call on Teams, which is a video platform. So I'm like outside my backyard at my dad's house. I look like a total mess. And I was like, oh my God, I'm about to get fired. So not how I expected it to go, but sure. So we end up talking, and he's like, you have to do this. Like, this is your work. And the rest is kind of history. But again, I am such a proponent of looking back and connecting the dots. When he called me and said that, I was like, I was in total shock. And I knew from that moment that everything was going to change, and it did. And then I was moved onto this team. And I will say, like, there's so many different ways people get into the roles they're in, the dream roles we all think of. And I think I probably am someone, I know I'm someone who has, for some people, the dream role, and for other people, like, absolutely not. But, for me, it's my dream role. And I had no idea that it could even exist. I didn't think it was possible. And all it took was that one thing, that one decision that I made, whether it was, not whether it was, but the one decision I made that was the right choice, that put me in the path, or on the path for the work I get to do today. And so I was able to essentially write a job description for a need that's out there in the market that I now get to serve, and now I get to grow with that need. So I know you asked like, how did this all happen? But I think like the continual aha for me is when you know something's right, you know it's right. So make the decision to do it. You don't know how it's going to turn out, but it will turn out. It just has to. Like I will say, like, it may not be the perfect thing. It may not happen in the perfect way. And certainly there was loss for me there. But for me, the most important thing is doing work that I feel deeply connected to, and I know why I'm here. So it turned out.
Yeah. I've got my little highlighter over here. I'm like, and highlight that the right decision might be brutally hard. And I thank you for your honesty on that. And really, again, knowing this is right, even though it's not easy. And I get chills every time. I've heard this story that Leah has shared several times now because I make her retell it every time we're in any group situation. And it gives me chills every time. Like, it makes me want to cry because that's what you want in life. That's exactly what you want for your work. You were brave, you were bold, you took a risk and trusted that this is why I'm here. And I'll never forget, Leah and I will walk virtually together. And I remember exactly where I was on our walk when you told me, you're like, oh my gosh, the CEO saw this and said, I have to have a show. I'm like, oh my word, like, did it get better than this? And that's because of you actually going for it, being vulnerable, taking risks. And I think oftentimes we'll see someone, and when the viewers or listeners listen to your podcast, they're going to think, oh, it's so easy for Leah, because you make it look easy. You make it seem like you were meant to do this. You were. And yet there were so many steps that weren't necessarily easy to get to where you're meant to be. And I got to get rid of the chills up my spine. I just love hearing that. Are you ready to play 1, 2, 3 with me? And we're going to have to do a part 2 because this is just too good to stop here. So we'll do our 1, 2, 3, and then we're coming back for another episode, you and me. All right. So what is one mindset shift that our listener might want to play with to open the door to possibility around self-discovery and reinvention?
In certain circles, I think there's some level of reverence to the idea that, like, the phrase that that's just how I am is a phrase that is respected or revered. I actually don't love that phrase because it puts you in a box. And so I think the mindset shift is maybe, I was just reading this, and I'm sure many people have heard this, but when goldfish are put into a tank, they secrete, they have a secretion that comes out that essentially is guiding how large or small they're going to get based on the size of the tank. So, from a mindset shift perspective, I'd say, like, how big is your tank and how big do you want it to be? And what would be different if you were put into a larger tank? What would being bigger look like? Whatever that means. I think it's different for everyone. But yeah, I think it's about, if you're the goldfish, how big are you going to let your tank grow?
Oh my gosh. I feel like I just want to take that quote and put it out all over the world, because you're right. It's like our tank can be this size here, or it can be a huge aquarium. Yeah. It could be a sea without even having, walls. Oh, Thank you. That's great. All right. What are 2 ideas or facts that you hope that our listeners take away?
I think the first idea would be, and this is something I still struggle with, but I will say, like, how can you get comfortable with the fact that uncertainty is the best possible place you can be? Mm-hmm. If things are certain, then you know exactly what's coming. And by the way, you don't ever really know what's coming, but how can you get more comfortable with that would be one. And then, 2's a little more worky focused, I guess, but I'm thinking about, as we go into 2023, what do I want to bring with me from really 2020 that shifted. And one of the things that has been really meaningful for me is the boundaries I set up around my work and how I balance the other things that I don't want to say balance, but how I prioritize and hold the other things that matter to me. Mm-hmm. So, although we are moving out of maybe some of the worst of COVID, we did get some gifts of relooking at our lives and saying what matters. And I think a lot of us are doing that different ways, but I just offer that we don't return to the way that we were, and that we do give ourselves space to actually enjoy our lives and savor, instead of a lot of the fast hustle productivity movement that we were doing before.
Yeah, I really love that. And one thing around that too, I think sharing that, I know you shared that with me when I was asking you if you could do something around something, and you said, I'm so tempted to say yes, but I just told myself I need to have some boundaries. And that was huge, because then I could say, I'm now not going to let you do it, because I want to support you and what you're hoping to create in your life. And so I think if we have people who we can also share that can help us stay focused on what we want to bring into our lives or let go of, that accountability, and people who want you to succeed in what you're hoping to do more or less of.
Yeah, well, and the explicitness is something we don't do a lot of, right? It's like you battle with yourself on whether or not you're going to set the boundary without just telling someone else, I'm trying to get better at setting boundaries because I'm burning out, or because I'm not savoring the moments that I am saying yes to when I overdo it. That changes, like you said, you are the best possible friend anyone could wish for, which is the kind of friend who's like, then I won't let this person do it, right? But I do think the explicit call out of like, this is what I'm trying to get better at, can also set people up on the other side to feel less about it being about them or being personal, and more about it being about me. And it's like the definition of boundaries I love, that I forget who said it, but I read it from Brene Brown, who shared it from someone else, which is the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And like, you can replace love with whatever you want, but it's like, how do I love both of us? And a lot of times that's saying no.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's great. That is great. And then I also would say, I just want to call back out the comfort with uncertainty. And I think in this world that we're living in, there are no other options. So we either we can learn how to surf or we can sink. And that is one of the big things that I'm finding leaders coming to us for around coaching, is how to navigate kind of turbulent and uncertain waters. And the more that we can find that calm inside, even in the storm around us, will help with that.
And I think like a lot of people that come to us that want to talk about uncertainty, you find, you know, in L&D and other places, is like, it's not that they're trying to get better at navigating uncertainty. It's that they're trying to create certainty.
Yeah, or they want to get out of it.
I don't want it anymore. So give me something that will make me certain, instead of things are uncertain. What do I need to do or shift within myself so that I can sit with this? And it's two totally different conversations, but most people don't realize the nuance there.
You are so right. It's how do you find that sense of calm when the storm is around you? William Bridges' book, Life Transitions, is phenomenal around navigating transitions. And he does talk about how transitions begin with an ending, then it goes into a neutral zone, and then a beginning. That neutral zone is what you're talking about. And people want to rush out of it because it's not comfortable. It's like being on a freeway with your car in neutral and you're like, get me out of this. Instead, he says that is the most important time, is for time for reflection, time to think about, like what you just said, what do I want to bring forward? What do I want to let go of? And to just sit and be. So if anyone's looking for a good book on transitions, it's old, but he is kind of the granddaddy / thought leader in transitions. All right. The last question. We always want leaders to have something that they could put into play and experiment with. What are 3 actions that you might recommend
when it comes to self-discovery and reinvention?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Or anything at all that you feel like sharing.
You know, I find that I love my work more when it resonates deeply with leaders or with people. And I find that the resonance comes from life experience and the things that are happening actually a lot of times outside of work that can be applied inside of work. Mm-hmm. So I might share, or not might share, I will share that as a leader at an organization, you are probably doing things in your world outside of work that could be applied to work that could actually empower you as a leader. So maybe the headline there is stop the separation. You are who you are. And the idea of being a leader simply means you are becoming more of who you are in the best possible way. And so if you're going to kind of fill those shoes or fill that role, you don't have to start from scratch. There's so much of you that exists outside of your working world and your having your work hat on that could be transferred over. And I think that that's where the resonance is mm-hmm. like the relationships we have with the people outside of work, with ourselves outside of work, with our hobbies, with, what we enjoy and our passions and how we can be better at integrating that. Yeah. So that I know you said 3, but that's to me that's a big one. I think the other 2 that I'm thinking about right now are how can we all be better at really having a foundation of well-being in our organizations, of like truly understanding that we are all whole human beings, that we are in a new environment, in a new world that we didn't expect 4 years ago, but one that's given us all the opportunity to rethink how we take care of ourselves. And so if it's a marathon, not a sprint, our careers, our work, our journeys, how can we be better at making that foundation real by modeling it ourselves? So I think a lot of times leaders share that it's something they think people should do, but don't do it themselves. Right. So it's like, how do you actually just start doing it? Because your modeling is more important than your words.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love both of those. And the bringing the whole self. I always say, we say executive coaching. They'll say, do you do executive coaching or life coaching? In my mind, we do life coaching. We call it executive coaching, but we have one life, and we're fooling ourselves if we think different people are showing up in both places. Sometimes you try to do that, but it's exhausting and it's going to impact your next point, Leah, and that's your well-being. And so being able to really think about your well-being in that context is huge. My very last question for you, people always want to know what's in it for me. So if we have, whether it's an organization or a leader who creates a culture of self-discovery and reinvention, what's possible?
What isn't? I mean, honestly, it's like that. Yeah, that's probably the mic drop, but it's truly like, in coaching, we learn in my coaching program, we learn the phrase, people are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. Mm-hmm. And I think in our work environments, we don't treat employees as if they are all naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And so we put people in boxes and say, go do these things. And there are certain people who absolutely thrive in that world, but there are so many things that are possible if you are willing to believe that perhaps there's an employee in your world or in your org who has an idea, who has the drive, the passion, or the interest to create something that you haven't seen created before. And so I think that what's possible is, when you think about your own abilities, what you've been able to create in your own life or in your own leadership or in your own work, or you've seen created in the world, all of that's possible from all of us. It's just a matter of, like, again, how big is the tank we're in, and how much can we grow? So my thing would be, what isn't possible?
Great answer. Leah Smart, I just love being with you. Thank you.
I love being with you too.
Thank you so much, and have a great day.